participating. Now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Janine Medley, Education Specialist at Cool Australia. An accomplished educator, Janine uses all of her professional energy to campaign for a better future. At Cool Australia, Janine has created education packages focused on disaster resilience, racism, health and wellbeing, and e-safety. In previous roles, she's helped aspiring school leaders set up their powers, step into their power and create innovative change, which is not creating cutting-edge education material. Janine enjoys dancing, board games, meditation, yoga, spoken word, and reading dystopian novels and dreams about becoming a published author and a digital nomad. Over to you, Janine.
Thank you, Owen. Great introduction. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that we've all come in after having a pretty rough 18 months facing a pandemic, especially those in Victoria and New South Wales. There might have been additional challenges in your life that has been thrown at you, and it may have drawn on more resilience than you knew that you were capable of. This can be a tough topic for some. I'm going to keep it light, but if you need to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, do so. For example, I've been listening to Brave by Sarah Bareilles all day on repeat, and that's been my anthem for this year, just to get me through. And just a little side note as well, we are rebranding from Cool Australia to cool.org. So if you see a logo looking more like that one when you log into our webpage next year, we're the same, guys, don't freak out. Just move on to the next slide. For those who don't know about Cool Australia, we provide education resources to help teachers and parents save time on their planning. So we have 180,000 members in 90% of Australian schools. So that makes us one of the most popular education providers in Australia. What sets us apart is that, as you heard from some of the projects I've been working on, we have a really strong focus to leverage education for a better world and empowering kids to be change makers. So we're a social and environment issues focused organisation, and we also do other content areas as well, like STEM, that don't necessarily always have a social and environmental focus, but that's our main drive. We work with like-minded partners like the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and most of our work is funded by philanthropy. If you move on. So we were approached by the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and it was probably about 12 months after the Black Summer fires. We were in the middle of a pandemic. Flooding had been an issue, especially around New South Wales, and we were hyper aware of the challenges that are being faced by many Australian communities in the face of all these natural hazards, including the children. And in 2020, we'd received a lot of inquiries for lessons on fire, including cultural burning practices. So luckily, we have a package of lessons called Cool Burning, and that was able to assist those teachers. We also created some just-in-time pandemic-related resources, but what we didn't have was any all hazards resources. So the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience had also noticed this gap. There was plenty of specific hazard resources, and there was plenty of all hazard resources in the primary area, especially in years 5 and 6. But what we didn't have was much in the all hazards area for secondary. So that's what we've aimed to achieve here. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see that there's, this is sort of what it looks like on our website. There's a link there and a QR code that will take you to the landing page of the project where you can access all of the lessons. So there's 7 in total, and it's a geography focused unit, but it does branch out into other subject areas. So it could be, depending on your school makeup, you could be able to use this with other teachers in different areas of the school, or you might be able to run it as an integrated or an interdisciplinary unit. The one that's different is the creative recovery one, which is more of an arts and civics HPE lesson, and that would be for those communities who have been affected by a hazard or a disaster. And there's some advice in there about how they can approach using the other resources, as well as just taking care of themselves and connecting back in with community as they're in recovery. Moving on. So what we wanted to do, keeping in mind that there'd been a lot going on in Australia at the time, and is that we really wanted to embed hope. We just prior to the pandemic, I don't know if you remember, there was a lot of climate crisis rallies with the kids coming out of schools. And I'd noticed, especially in my nephew, who was about 12 at the time, that there was a lot of downheartedness. A lot of kids were feeling really lost, and they were not very hopeful about the future. And on top of that, with the fires and the pandemic, it was just taking a massive toll. So embedding hope in these lessons was really, really important to us. It's also can be quite a triggering topic, especially after the fires, when there'd been such a devastating loss of biodiversity and life. There was a lot of burnt koalas on the news. We really knew that these lessons need to be safe. And we also wanted kids to feel empowered to connect with their communities and take actions to protect themselves and their loved ones. So that was sort of at the core of what we were designing, alongside the 7 pillars of the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, which Owen just outlined for you. That was sort of the basis of the work. So in terms of how to deliver the content, if you just move on for us, thanks, Greg. Next slide, Greg. Thank you. We'd like to see these lessons delivered as a 6-unit approach. So rather than taking them individually, we'd love to see them done as a package, and they're designed to be done as a package in order. But if you can't get to do that, that's completely fine. What we do want to make sure that we do is include that hope message, and the positive impacts of natural hazards, which is, I think, the 3rd lesson in the package, is really, really powerful for embedding that message of hope. I'm just still waiting on that next slide there, Greg. Are we able to just flick that one across? Should be on how to deliver the content, or the one, slide 7. Not working. Okay, I'll keep forging on. So it's best. I'm looking at the wrong screen, I think. Anyway, when you're in recovery, I'd really like those schools to be looking at how they can get advice from those lessons. There's going to be lessons in the package that are going to be suitable for them, and there's going to be lessons that aren't so suitable. Looking at the harmful effects of natural hazards may not be appropriate in your community at that time. But what we do really encourage is that you reach out to your community, and that you get them involved. All ages, cultures, and backgrounds are going to be interested in this work. Disaster and hazards affects everyone equally. So it's a really great idea to pull in as many voices as you can and get as many people involved, and that's going to make kids feel really empowered and strong in themselves. And just on the next slide then. So today I'm going to take you through 3 of the lessons. I'm just going to briefly outline what they involve. So the first one's the positive impacts. That's the hope-based lesson. We've got one on preparing for natural hazards, and there's one on adaptation and mitigation. So if you look at the picture for this positive impacts lesson, it's got a burnt forest. This is an image from the Black Saturday fires, and you'll see that it's been burnt right down to the ground. There's ash all over the ground. But what surprised people was how resilient the forest was, and the fact that the regeneration started so soon after. We started to see some greenery coming back. And, you know, we've all heard, and especially if you're a humanities teacher, we know the story of the Nile River in ancient Egypt, and it was something that made the soil more fertile for the people who lived around it. So, you know, as the cornerstone of the Egyptian empire, the Nile River and its flooding, we know that natural hazards have a natural process, and that sometimes it has a purpose, and that we can leverage that. So, you know, we've also learnt this from cultural burning practices. You know, if we don't burn the forest, some plants can't regrow. So focusing on the ways that natural hazards don't have to be disasters, but can support an ecosystem, can really help young people feel more positive and remain calm when things might come their way that they're not expecting. It's an incursion and excursion focused lesson. So it's one of those ones where we love you to connect with the community. They can come to you, you can go to them. You might connect with someone who's an expert in fire or cultural burning. It's a great way to embed Indigenous perspectives. And the kids get an opportunity to really identify any burning questions that they have and seek alternative perspectives to what they might see in the mainstream media. The next lesson is preparing for natural hazards. So this is more of a short-term or immediate planning for emergency style lesson. And it's sort of an extension of what the Red Cross did with the pillowcase project. So they had young children, they'd get a pillowcase and they'd write and draw various items that they would take with them in the case of an evacuation. And then that was like their responsibility. They knew they had the pillowcase, they had the pictures and the words of what they needed to pack. And that's something that they could do if there was an emergency and they needed to leave home quickly. So we've taken that idea and just expanded it a bit. We've made it more age appropriate for years 7 and 8. So they can learn about, they get an opportunity that's quite fun where they get to write an evacuation packing list under pressure. So there's a 2-minute timer on what would you take with you. And you know, it'll be a bit anxiety inducing for them, and they'll get a bit of experience of what it's like to have to pack in a hurry. Then they'll have an opportunity to look back over their list and be like, well, is what I packed relevant? Is it going to be helpful? Have I packed too much junk that I don't need? Have I got essential items like a torch? Have I got spare batteries? Have I got my phone charger? And then they get to go and review their list and write a new list. So if you just move to the next slide, they'll have a bit more of an idea of their packing list, because I think there's a lot of families, and my sister's one of them. She lives in a bushfire prone area, and those families are really great at being aware of the risks and planning ahead. But people who maybe live by the beach or somewhere else, they're not as good at planning for these hazards and emergencies. And I know that we've learned with the pandemic, anything can literally happen at any time when we least expect it. So this will really help those kids who aren't used to having to plan ahead, get ready, prepare their property for things like flood or fire, and make an emergency plan. There's also an opportunity to look over the school's emergency evacuation procedures, make sure that they're diversity friendly. Can someone with a disability or a non-English speaker understand the instructions? Are they up to date? Do we know where to go? Are our evacuation areas still safe? And then they can have a bit more responsibility. If there's a fire drill or whatever it is that you do at your school, they can see whether or not it worked and do a bit of an assessment around that and offer suggestions for improvement. The last lesson I wanted to show you is on adaptation and mitigation. And this is more of a long-term planning, career-focused lesson. So they look at things like engineering. There's a bit of STEM in there, and it's more about how to live and adapt to a world where hazards are part of a normal everyday life. And we know that climate change is likely to increase the amount of hazards and disasters that we face. So how we build and how we live and restructuring that is going to be something that this generation is going to need to really think about when they're starting to build and buy their homes. So if you just want to click on the video there for me, Greg, you'll be able to see an example of a resource that we use. You can press play.
I'm Richard Coote, I'm one of the directors at Backer Architects. We're the designers of the UK's first amphibious house. When the client approached us to build them a new waterside home, they knew that it came with a number of issues. It was a flood risk site. So they said to us we wanted wonderful panoramic views, but when a flood comes we want a house which is safe, dry and insurable. The solution that we came up with was an amphibious house, which is effectively a combination of a floating house and has the benefits of an elevated house.
So as the water level rises, you can see that we've developed what we call a kind of intuitive landscape, whereby it's terraced at different levels, so you can see the flood water coming up. So as the water level encroaches over this point, you can see over the patio, and the building will start to slowly move.
Here we are. This is one of the most interesting points of the amphibious house. We have the wet dock that it sits in. We have the concrete floating base, the can float hull. We have the guidepost behind us.
The amphibious house actually offers a solution to rise higher or lower, whatever the flood level is. And of course that gives people peace of mind into the future. And this is a building therefore that's adapted already to the future.
Well, thanks. So what the kids will get to do after watching some really great videos like that and learning a bit more about how houses can be designed to help us live in environments where hazards are normal is practice building some of these structures. So using, you've got your toothpicks and your marshmallows there, there'll be straws and clay and other materials that we recommend, and they'll get it to practice building structures that can withstand floods, strong winds, earthquakes, and avalanches. It's like a little station set up, and it'll be a lot of fun and a lot of mess. And it finishes off the unit in a really positive way that looks forward, and it takes everything that they've learned in the previous lessons so that they can apply that then in the real world, in their real life going forward, or at least consider some of these things when and if they get to the stage where they're buying their own properties or having to think about this in their jobs. So that's all I have for you today, just to show you again, if you need the QR code to get to the website, you can grab it there, and I will see you in the Q&A. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Janine. I think I saw that house on an episode of Grand Designs once, actually. But it's a great example of how architecture can be developed to work with the natural environment, not against it.